And I think a lot of people start to talk about the situation in Libya wrapping up or entering a new chapter, I think it's important, too, to take a look back to February when we first heard the speech from President Obama when he announced that Libya needed our help.
The United States has maintained a set of core principles which guide our approach. These principles apply to the situation in Libya. As I said last week, we strongly condemn the use of violence in Libya. The American people extend our deepest condolences to the families and loved ones of all who've been killed and injured. The suffering and bloodshed is outrageous, and it is unacceptable.
So I want to hone in. We strongly condemn the use of violence in Libya. That was President Obama back in February. Let's fast forward to today and talk about some of the goals in this mission and whether or not they were achieved. And to help me do that, I've got National Coordinator for the Answer Coalition, Brian Becker, here in studio, and Richard Spencer, the Executive Director at the National Policy Institute, who's in Whitefish, Montana. And Brian, let's start with you here first. So much to talk about when we think about winners and losers. But just with intervention, and I know President Obama said time and time again, this was in the name of human rights. Were human rights protected as a result of NATO intervention?
No, this is the grossest violation of human rights. I mean, whenever the United States or Britain or France, the colonizers and enslavers of Africa, intervene in Africa or the Middle East or anywhere, they assign their mission a noble cause to protect freedom, to protect democracy, to protect civilians in the case of Resolution 1973. But this is a long-standing policy of the U.S. government to overthrow the government of Libya, the country that possesses, as you've said before, the largest oil reserves in all of Africa. It has nothing to do with human rights. And in fact, when you bomb Tripoli, when you drop 7,500 bombs and missiles on a country that did nothing to the American people, that's an act of aggression. That's a war crime. That's a crime against humanity. That's the complete opposite of defense of human rights.
All right, I want to go to Richard and kind of just get your response to that and what you're thinking about what you're seeing today, throughout the day in Libya.
Sure. I might not use the same language as your other guests, but I do agree with him in many ways. When this conflict began, a Pentagon spokesman famously said that we are not going after Gaddafi, and the UN resolution that was passed was actually only to enforce a no-fly zone. But I think everyone knew from the beginning that this was going to become a regime change operation and that it was an attempt to put someone on the throne who was a little bit less threatening to the United States interests. But what I would ask anyone who supports this, and you can actually find a lot of these, particularly amongst the formerly anti-war left, who have now come out for Obama's bombing campaign, do you think that Gaddafi would have killed more people than NATO has if they would have let him, so to speak, crack down on some of his protesters? The answer is of course, no. That this bombing campaign has killed far more civilians. It's caused far more damage than Gaddafi might have done if he would have tried to control a few protesters.
I think a couple important points that Richard brought up in terms of sort of the change, the evolution of people's mindset in terms of, just before our involvement in Libya, there was a lot of anti-war talk by people on both sides of the aisle in this, upcoming political season about the U.S. involvement in wars. All of a sudden, we're involved in Libya. A lot of people frustrated, violation of the War Powers Act. Is this another war? But Richard is right. We are hearing from the mainstream media to politicians to people who are now saying this involvement by NATO, by the U.S., was a victory. Victory for Obama. What do you think about, what are the messages, Brian, that are sort of getting lost here?
Well, the basic message is that Libya's basic fundamental sovereignty has been shredded. That the great powers, those who have the weapons, those who have the money, those who have decided a long time ago to overthrow this government, if they succeed, are sending a message not only to Libya, but to Syria, to Venezuela, to Cuba, to any government that seeks to be independent, that seeks to control its own resources. Now, we have to remember, Gaddafi drew the ire of the West right in 1969, not because of violation of human rights. He suspended and evicted the Wheelus Air Force Base, one of the major U.S. Air Force bases in the Middle East, a big part of the Cold War. He evicted 2 British air bases. From that day on, when Libya took control of its own sovereignty and said foreign occupation forces and these military bases have to be closed down, that's when they decided, then, in 1970, that they were going to overthrow him. This has been a 40-year-long campaign. It sends a dangerous message to others who want to be independent. I don't think the battle is over yet, of course. I think inside of Libya, millions of people, contrary to the media assertions, don't want foreign occupation and, in fact, have, defended the government, even if they have grievances against the government.
Richard, you started one of your recent articles with Ding Dong, the oppressive dictator is dead. What do you think about this transitional national council that's supposed to come and to the forefront and lead this grassroots democratic movement? Is this realistic? What do you think we see in the coming weeks should Gaddafi somehow become in the rebels, in their
Well, no,
power?
I think this grassroots movement for democracy or something is a kind of Hollywood creation. I think the rebels are essentially people who have a beef against Gaddafi. They want power. They might want to even enact some revenge. And that's what they're about. But they're also clearly surrogates of the United States and NATO. As I also point out in my piece, despite all this, the Hollywood story of this ragtag crew who just want to vote or something like that, immediately when they were involved, they established a central bank. These rebels. I wonder that was one of their first operations. So clearly, they were acting as surrogates for NATO. They were acting as surrogates for the United States that wanted regime change and had a kind of bigger picture at play. But I'll just add real quickly. I think the immediate aftermath of this war is going to be some kind of chaos, because these rebels are not just, this united little, ragtag crew. These rebels often hate one another. There are actually some reports of the rebels calling down NATO airstrikes against one another, against their kind of rivals within coalition. So I think what is going to be in the immediate aftermath is going to be something quite nasty.
These are certainly armed rebels who make up a group that may have the one goal in common of taking down Gaddafi. Certainly have a lot of different ideas, though, about how rules should happen. Brian, I want to talk bigger picture now. Certainly, it's been quiet a little bit in the Middle East and North Africa. This is a lot of people saying the start of the next Arab Spring, the Arab summer. Post-Libya, after Libya, in addition to Libya, what about Syria? What do you see happening next in regards to other countries, Bahrain, Syria, as we move across the Middle East and North Africa?
Well, you can use a compass, which is whoever the U.S. corporate media and the U.S. government is demonizing, whoever they've decided must go, is then in the crosshairs of the next destabilization campaign.
So you think some of the mainstream media here in this country is calling the shots here?
Well, I think they're echoing the policy of the U.S. government. They function as a propaganda arm. There's a lot made about the U.S. has a free press, but you see a complete uniformity of position once the State Department and the White House establish a position. There's a lot of reasons for that. But I think what's coming next is that the United States is determined, if they do succeed in overthrowing Gaddafi and conquering Libya, bringing it back into an American, British, French sphere of influence, that they will try to do the same in Syria. So I think we see an expanding level of intervention. They'll always say it's for humanitarian good. It's always to protect civilians. We're going to see more intervention. That's why this snowball is getting bigger and bigger, and I think it'll lead to additional conflict. So you have Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan. It's just like Dick Cheney said, endless war, but with a new administration.
And real quick, Richard, I want to pose this question to you. What's the likelihood that this will follow in the footsteps of the countries that Brian just mentioned?
I think, unfortunately, there's a great deal of likelihood to that, for the simple reason that I think the regime wants a distraction. They want a number of wars, maybe even a big war, in order to take people's minds off what's really happening to the country, and that is the internal collapse of the United States, the debt crisis, the crisis among the middle class and the lower class. They want to take people's minds away from that and give them a war.
Stop looking at what's going on in Washington. Look everywhere else. I want to thank you guys so much for talking with me today. Brian Becker, National Coordinator for the Answer Coalition, and Richard Spencer, Executive Director at the National Policy Institute.